Hello class, this section will be quite extensive. It will be a lecture on the Renaissance realm of my Saga of Humanity series. Next we will cover the Enlightenment realm in the Saga of Humanity series. Bear with me, this video will be quite long. Grab a cup of water if you need to, and we'll dive right in. The Renaissance came with a renewed interest in the world at large, a thirst for knowledge of the natural world and the historical, broader context in which we live, and assenting how things are than how they ought, in theory, to be. I've written on a lot of Renaissance writers. In particular, I've written on a couple individuals post-Renaissance period as well, including Thomas Hobbes, Francis Bacon, and René Descartes. And we will see those figures later on. In my theology degree, I went over what is called the Reformatio, which is the Reformation, which we will explore after the Renaissance realm. And so I include in this lecture not only the Renaissance, but also the Reformatio. So, the Reformatio being that which occurred between the Renaissance and the 16th and century and 17th century developments in the scientific revolution. So, and that is before the Enlightenment. But I digress that during the Renaissance period, we see the beginnings of modern science, history, and philosophy. In a sense, the Renaissance was another great insurgence of the right hemisphere, but even more pronounced than that of the ancient realm. For from the outset, there is a self-conscious retrospection towards that ancient realm of classical antiquity, a second level of self-consciousness. This is before we get to Descartes, before we get to modern philosophy. We have Petrarch's view. Petrarch was a writer, a prolific writer, and a key figure of the Renaissance. The Renaissance characteristic of a sudden coming into awareness of aspects of experience that had unaccountably been neglected. In science, a return to looking at things carefully as they are, as I have said before, rather than as they were known to be. The important rediscovery of perspective, understood by late Greek painters and Roman wall paintings, but also the faculty of perspective had been lost for 1,000 years during the Middle Ages until Giotto in the late 13th to early 14th century. The first Renaissance painter to employ perspective was Giotto. Depth relies principally on the right hemisphere of the brain, but each hemisphere has its contribution to perspective. Perspectival space is related to individuality, a classical element of the Renaissance realm, since perspective mediates a view of the world from an individual standpoint, one particular place, at one particular time, rather than a God's eye view from nowhere. Perspective is then the means of relating the individual to the world and enormously enhancing the sense of the individual as standing within the world, where depth draws in the viewer through the pool of the imagination, and a means of turning the individual into an observer, a geometer, detached from his or her own object space. Equally, the sense of the individual as distinct from the society to which he or she belongs enables both a comprehension of others as individuals with feelings exactly like one's own, the grounds of empathy, and at the same time a detachment of the individual from the world around the individual. Here we find in the paintings of the Renaissance a sense of lived time. The sense of lived time is right hemisphere derived. It is a property of the right hemisphere. And lived time is not just an awareness of the fact that time, the same laws of immutability or change, existing immutably or non-changing for each and every person at all times and all places, but is distinguished in the sense of the rise and fall of particular cultures, irreplaceable as they are, where it is the value of transitory that is celebrated. For being able to see one's own age in a broader context of cultural history was a defining aspect of the Renaissance, which depended on the contextualizing function of the right hemisphere. And as we will see, it was quite key that the Renaissance historians, humanistic historians, distinguished themselves from the long time, from the fall of the Roman Empire to their own day. We have personal reflection in the Renaissance. So if you can imagine clever and self-confident people at the height of their power, surrounded by the symbols of their knowledge, sophistication and prosperity brought down with great passion and pity their plight of old age, once beautiful and well-respected for wit and excellence, are now pushed aside and treated as fools of an ancient world. We recognize the poems here of Donne, Marvell, and Crashaw, which we might go over in our historical poetry playlist. The Renaissance and the beginning of the Enlightenment period. We have thoughts and ideas and historical action in the Renaissance. From the earliest, all the Renaissance arts exhibited a newfound delicacy of feeling, which could be heard and expressed emphatically. One need only mention Giotto onwards in the expression of power in the visual arts. Music, at the time of the Renaissance, saw the efflorescence of polyphony, with an emphasis on highly expressive melodic lines and complex harmony for the first time. We have Gregorian chants of the Middle Ages, but now we see more harmony and a more melodic tune in music. And we see false relations and suspensions, again, seeing the relationship of the parts to the whole ensemble. The greatest productions were melancholy in nature, which in the 16th century was commonly associated with intelligence, wisdom, and judiciousness, i.e., madrigals celebrating love that is only occasionally requited. Thoughtful nature can be found in Shakespeare, i.e., the Merchant of Venice. In sooth, I know not why it wearies me, you say it wearies you, but how I came by it, what stuff 'tis made of, whereof is it born, I am to learn. That last bit was a quote from Shakespeare. Because of the Renaissance reliance on indirect expression, metaphor, and imagery, and a tolerance toward the incomplete and unresolved as opposed to the explicitness and the resolution of contradictory propositions, in the pursuit of clarity and certainty, the constitution of its epistemology, or the study and theory of knowledge, is necessarily congenial to ambiguity and union of opposites. Longing is one such concept as ancient as humankind, and it is no such exaggeration to mention that the Renaissance began with the deepest of longing, that of love, that of affection, in a searching out of the past, a lost golden age which the pre-archaic Homeric Greeks once believed. And Old Saxon and Old High German, we see that to long is in the sense to yearn for, to seem or be, hence to reach out or extend towards. Longing then is a desire for union and reunion. A latter writer once said, quote, art that is great is the arrangement of the environment so as to provide for the soul vivid but transient values. Something new must be discovered, the permanent realization of values extending beyond its former quality. This is from Alfred North Whitehead in 1926. Art, then, in its nature, impels humans to reach out and onward to something beyond ourselves, and the art itself, in contrast, transient values instantiated in what the art embodies where it exemplifies with the permanent realization that values extend beyond themselves. Individuality, again in the Renaissance, and as it was invented by the ancients, gives rise to a longing, a seeking after originality, a turning from the traditionally received, often communal and or conventional patterns of behavior and thoughts. We see Burckhardt, a historian, writing in 1955, writing on the development of the individual, from which I get this on page 80 to 84 and page 279. Quote, in the Renaissance, the unconscious, involuntary, intuitive, and implicit, as opposed to their counterparts, that which cannot be formalized or instilled into others by processes governed by rules, was respected. In the Renaissance, we consider Renaissance beliefs about the artist, legend, myth, and magic in the image of the artist, and a historical experiment. We can see that from the writings of Chris and Kurtz in 1934. Skill, however, is not a product of effortal learning, it is intuitive. This was also an idea concerning the view of the artist that was common in the world of classical antiquity. Inspiration cannot be relied on or willed into being. It limits the power of conscious intention in order to create. Because by instinct things, the mind is stimulated to new inventions. This is a quote by Leonardo da Vinci from the Vatican Library, Trattato della Pintura, Codex Urbanus, in the year 1270. We see here in about the time of 1400 CE, in retrospect, the Renaissance exemplifies the return of perspective, but also the view reborn that the artist's creation is a discovery as opposed to an invention. Like talent, which is also discovered, not invented, the work itself issuing not from conscious effort, but from intuition and inspiration. What is imitated is nature in the Renaissance, the artist's teacher. Naturam imitandum esse. It is this that gave rise to a preference for what nature gives over what humans have made, or God has made for that matter. That knowledge comes from nature, not from what others teach, and a realization to give reliance to experience before confined or being impeded by an expectation of a God. So many Renaissance artists renounced wealth and material prosperity in the pursuit of their arts, living in solitude, enjoying inspiration from nature. You might remember Plato, an ancient world character who thought the artist, in a sense, as a diabolical arch-deceiver, willing to go any length or depth in order to secure the accurate ability to perfectly imitate nature. We see that in Plato's Republic. The artist then is like Prometheus, the god who stole fire in order to give hope to humanity. Such views concerning the nature of artistic creation is not confined to place and time, but are common in many world cultures. And so, for Montaigne, as for humanistic Erasmus, the body became once more to be loved, to be shown affection as it was naturally, rather than being formally experienced and perceived as a prison of the soul. Forsake not nature, nor misunderstand her. Her mysteries are read without faith's eyesight. She speaks in our flesh, and from our senses, delivers down her wisdoms to our reason. This is the chorus Quintus Tartarorum from Mustafa. Renaissance, concluding remarks, although we are not done talking about the Renaissance, but here we see a sense of depth that is intrinsic to understanding things in context. They gave rise to the Renaissance Italian humanists came up with the idea of attaching themselves from cultures and civilizations that had existed before. And so, it implies a metaphysical beyond physical depth, a respect for the existence of myths and metaphors, but also the respect for historical context was, in the sense of the Renaissance, it constitutes the interconnectedness of knowledge and understanding, which implies, in a loose sense, the necessity of the broadest possible context for knowledge. The Renaissance man comes into being. One pretends to be able to do something effortlessly and benign deceit, which is in reality actually involves a great deal of learning and a degree of application. Skills of which I am all too familiar are many times acquired by mechanical and explicit methods, and progressed by an intuitive imitation and unreflective experience, by relevance when one considers their fate in a global world context, historically speaking. And perhaps the skill of hiding one's own skill was too self-conscious, depending on the circumstances in which we find ourselves, for most, but I found it to be amusing and entertaining nonetheless. But with the knowledge of Renaissance, perhaps the idea is to return to the historic past and the rediscovery of the classical world in the Renaissance. And it extrapolates to return to the prehistorical past in what I call a new Renaissance that is now occurring in the 21st century. Now, their pertinence confines in the increasement of knowledge and in the exemplars of wisdom, virtue, and statecraft that it yields, while also recognizing that human dignity is found in our unique capacity to, in a sense, choose our own destiny as historical beings in time with knowledge of the Renaissance, through the pursuit of reason and a love for studying and understanding life and nature for its own sake. And this is illustrated by the works of Petrarch and Dante. And we continue on to compare the art of the Renaissance to medieval art. The latter, medieval art, is dominated by religious themes, while the former, Renaissance art, embraces a wider palette of subjects. The Renaissance marked a distinct turning away, a repentance from a relentless focus on the world as a dangerous place of temptations and tears, of sin, to a celebration of life and its more joyous possibilities, marking a refreshing revival of poets, thinkers, and artists. Of course, intellectual life in the Renaissance is reflected upon as many of its thinkers and writers also turned away without repent from the narrow technicalities of the scholastic philosophy of the Middle Ages to a broader focus on civilization, life, and society, the turn to a wider application of intellectual endeavor, the turn from technical to a more general philosophical interest. We find the first character in my story a critical explorer of past intellectual history, who remarked that his century, the 15th century, CE, quote, restored to light the liberal arts which were almost extinct, grammar, poetry, rhetoric, painting, sculpting, music, and architecture, like a golden age. And this comes from Frissino, an Italian humanist writer who lived from 1433 to 1499. A theory of rhetoric was to attain maximal effect in persuading or educating an audience. A speech, lecturer, or a book must go through several pertinent stages. They recovered in the Renaissance an ancient art of these different pertinent stages that rhetoric and the art of persuasion must go through. The first being inventio in Latin, which is the gathering of materials and information. Dispositio, the arrangement of the said material and information. The illocutio, a appropriate expression in a language. And then prepared speech was memoria, or something that was memorized or learned by heart. And pronunciatio, which is the pronunciation, the practicing of emphasis, pauses, gestures, and then the manner of delivery, how you deliver your speech or your lecture or whatever you're doing. In particular, the dispositio stage had structure. It had this dispositio, the arrangement of the material information, went through several stages as well. It went through the stage of exordium, the introduction, the narratio, the setting and the case that was to be made, the divisio, or division, specifying the main points of the argument. The confutatio, you are refuting the objections towards your statement. And then the conclusio, and is a summation of the dispositio. So, in the historical context of the Renaissance, one finds exhortation and instruction, the invocation of principles or historical examples, in order to influence the choices, decisions, and actions of both ruler and individual. All practical concerns were addressed. The first main point that I want to make here is that the first subject of the trivium, the medieval school curriculum of grammar, rhetoric, and logic, acquired new significance in the Renaissance period. Originally, it meant the study of Latin, the study of the language of Latin. But indeed, the first subject of the trivium now reasserted its relevance to ethics, because rhetoric is about persuading, influencing, advising, and challenging, and therefore immediately applies to ethical debate. This, my friends, is the reason why the Renaissance, the rebirth intellectuals, studied the treatises of rhetoric and poetics of Aristotle and Horace, and their commentaries on them, and Cicero emphasized ethical, and one might also add psychological aspects. And it was Petrarch, as I have mentioned before, who led in this recalibration of interest. My second point is this, that Plato had come back to life in the Renaissance, not from the grave, but from his completed works, appearing in Latin and attaining considerable influence, especially in Gorgias, which is one of his dialogues, which was translated by a profound, significant figure in the Renaissance period by the name of Leonardo Bruni, where Plato exhibits his strictures against the sophists and their rhetorical tricks used to misinform their audiences. From their reading and rediscovery of dozens of writers of classical antiquity, the Renaissance historians thought about the complexities of real life, the difficult choices people are often forced to make, and the changes and variabilities of experience and circumstance. In this sense, the Renaissance rhetoricians could argue that philosophy, which explores absolutes, has the luxury of ignoring realities, while the rhetoric respects and addresses them. In Aristotle's rhetoric, which was available to them at this time, his point is that the art of rhetoric is central to the practicalities of life and society. Cicero states, quote, "To us orators belong the broad estates of wisdom and learning." Of course, Cicero was a Roman writer. It is interesting to note that much intellectual energy at this time was invested by Renaissance thinkers in such absurdities like magic, alchemy, and astrology, but nevertheless it was partly in reaction to this that the science and philosophy of the 16th century arose, especially important in the 17th century. We see the scientific revolution occurring at that time. But it's also interesting to note that the absolute dominance of Aristotle in latter philosophy, primarily in the scholastics of the medieval ages, brought tensions resulting in charges of religious heresy due to the bearing of philosophical disputes on prominent theological doctrines that had been thought to be true. And given that the majority, if not all of the populace at the time were religious in some sense or another, Plato, compared to Aristotle, was a more congenial figure with regard to his views and Neoplatonist interpretations of them. Plato was highly welcomed in his reintroduction by intellectuals. But given that Platonism did not usurp Aristotelianism at this time, the interest in his works at the time of Renaissance had the courteous effect of weakening Aristotle's authority, which in fact gave later scientists and philosophers in the 17th century a less difficult time in their task of rejecting the views of Aristotle. Now, true and accurate history tells a good story. In fact, the Platonist revival is precisely datable to a specific event at a specific place and time. We are brought back to the city of Florence in Italy in the year 1439 CE, where a conference was held that had the aim of healing the breach between the powers of the papacy and military tensions between the Holy Roman Empire and the Ottoman Empire. Now, at this time, as a matter of fact, that Florence's de facto ruler and founder of the Medicean dynasty was a man of great culture, Cosimo de' Medici, the Elder, who embraced the opportunity provided by the conference to welcome the Byzantine scholars, those of the eastern parts of the former Roman Empire, who accompanied the ambassadors from Constantinople, formerly Byzantium and now currently Istanbul. One of these scholars was Gemistos, who lived from 1355 to 1452, but he was also known popularly as Platon. Platon was a leading scholar at Byzantium, and he was a Neoplatonist. And in 1439, he lectured in Florence on Plato and the differences between Plato and Aristotle. These lectures were later published De Differentiis Aristotelius et Platonis, which sparked a controversy with the defenders of Aristotle. Regardless, though, the point here is made that interest in Plato was vitally stimulated and galvanized an interest in learning Greek. And it's the importance of learning Greek that the ancient writers of classical antiquity were finally given new significance. So a historical event in 1453 led many of Constantinople's scholars into a diaspora, were spreading out due to Constantinople's fall to the Ottomans. And one such character, a victim of the historical context in which he lived, was Argyropoulos. And he lived from 1415 to 1487, and he had originally studied at the University of Padua in Italy, but at this time had returned to Florence to lecture on Greek language and philosophy. He was an extremely important figure because his student was Marsilio Ficino, which we have mentioned earlier, who went on to translate Plato's works into Latin. Extremely important for people who spoke Latin at the time, and all our scholarship was in Latin. And he headed the Platonic Academy, founded and funded by Cosimo de' Medici in Florence. Ficino also translated into Latin writings by Plotinus, Porphyry, and Iamblichus. Ficino's student, in turn, was Giovanni Pico, one of the greatest writers of the Renaissance, Pico della Mirandola, who lived from 1463 to 1494. So we see that Ficino was the student of let's see here. Here we have that the student of Ficino was Giovanni Pico, and Pico issued a challenge in Rome to all of the scholars of Europe to debate his 900 theses. In the essay that he wrote to accompany and explain the intent behind the theses, the oration of the dignity of man, the opening words reflect the essence of the Renaissance. Quote, I quote Pico here, I have read in the ancient writings of the Arabians that, on being asked what on this stage of the world seemed most evocative of wonder, replied that there was nothing to be seen more marvelous than man. Here we see a return to the exuberant, joyous celebration of humankind, of the human body, and of the human self that was lost in the medieval ages, and where humankind was seen as sinful. So mind that its primary effect was an exuberant celebration of the worth of humankind and everything associated with life in the world. A shift of focus from anxiety about getting safely into the afterlife at all costs. This, my dear friends and comrades, is the key to understanding humanism, as it was in the Renaissance. And Pico's oration has been described as an instrumental text in capturing the essence of the Renaissance. Pico's argument is to search for knowledge anywhere and everywhere raised humankind above the rest of creation. And in extolling the philosophical virtues of mathematics, Pico was in agreement with his older contemporary Nicholas of Cusa, who lived from 1401 to 1464, the German scholar, who viewed mathematics as the highest knowledge because it alone is certain. And indeed, this view placed Plato's theory of knowledge above Aristotle's empirical interest in the natural sciences. But preferring Plato to Aristotle did not impede Cusa from reliance on empirical methodology in certain respects. To Nicholas Cusa is attributed the idea of measuring a patient's pulse rate by means of a water clock. Alas, tumultuous political circumstances of the late 15th century and other major events around the year 1492, the expulsion of the Moors from Spain, Columbus's discovery of the New World, the publication of the Alnacinos on the errors of Pliny, threats of the invasion of Italy by France, which happened actually in 1494, brought the Florentine promotion of Platonism to an end. Now we get into a note on Renaissance humanism. So, in today's 21st century world, the word humanist denotes a person who has a non-religious ethical outlook. But in the historical context of the Renaissance, the word humanism denotes scholars and intellectuals who believe that the studia humanitatis of grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry, and ethics would help to develop effective citizens dedicated to an intelligent vita activa. Note that the source of inspiration for the material of these studies was explicitly classical antiquity, the writings of the Greeks and the Romans. The rediscovery of the intellectual culture of classical antiquity in ancient times was expressly understood as a rebirth, a renaissance, by the leaders of the new movement, and its central defining feature was humanism. And as has been previously been mentioned before, Petrarch, formerly known as Francesco Petrarca, 1304 to 1374, is referred to as the father of humanism because of his self-aware promoting of a new outlook. Mind you, this humanism is separate from the humanism that is called Erasmian humanism from Erasmus. And basically, the self-promoting of this new outlook that Petrarch was trying to promote was, one, the collecting of ancient manuscripts, two, the advocacy of the value of classical thought and letters, and three, the description of the elapsed time between classical antiquity and his own time's rediscovery of its values as the, quote, Middle Ages. So Petrarch was the one who invented that term. Petrarch excited enthusiasm for finding forgotten and or lost manuscripts in monasteries and old archives, and he encouraged their translation and publication, an endeavor shared to great effect by others, such as Giovanni Boccaccio, see Decameron, the Ciceronian, Collusio, Salutati, and Poggio Bracciolini. Petrarch encouraged Boccaccio to study classical literature. Boccaccio called him my teacher and master, and the fruit was his encyclopedia of Greek and Roman mythology, the Genealogia Decorum Gentilium, a key text for Renaissance humanism and art. Our next character, Collusio Salutati, who lived from 1331 to 1406, was the great chancellor of Florence, whose letters and writing style were modeled after Cicero, and who spent a fortune on collecting ancient manuscripts in the process of rediscovering epistulae ad familiares, or letters to his friends. And so he spent a lot of his time finding ancient manuscripts and translating certain writers like Seneca and Cicero, which contained commentary and argument on the loss of Rome's republican liberties. Salutatis's later work, De Tyranno, on the tyrant, owed much to the view of Cicero, and nevertheless he was a generous promoter of Bracciolini. One of the greatest of finds is owed to Bracciolini, who lived from 1380 to 1459, who sent his scouts far and wide in the search for manuscripts into such wonderful places as Germany, Switzerland, France, and across Italy, and rediscovered large number of lost works, including the De Rerum Natura of Lucretius. The philologist Lorenzo Valla, who existed from 1407 to 1457, argued that religious texts should be subjected to the same philosophical analysis as other texts by the classical writers and authors. Lorenzo Valla's views about the application of radical criticism to religious texts were not fully implemented, however, until the 19th century, and this occurred mostly in Germany. The poet and scholar Poliziano, mentioned in connection with Pico della Mirandola, was an innovator in Latin style, like Salutati in the century before his own. Poliziano translated Homer, Epictetus, Galen, and Plutarch into Latin, and published editions of Virgil and Catullus that sought to be accurate. He served as tutor and was invited by Ficino to lecture on classical literature at the Platonic Academy. Influence. And there he influenced students from all over Europe, promoting interest in Pliny the Younger and Ovid, and encouraged greater precision in the translating and editing of classical texts. Renaissance humanism was, in a sense, and above all else, an educational movement, and Florence's Platonic Academy was an expression of this. Another interesting character, the brilliant teacher Giorino Veronese, who existed from 1374 to 1460. And here we see that the Renaissance mainly started in the 14th and 15th centuries CE, before the Reformatio of the 16th century, and the scientific revolution of the 17th century, taught Greek. Veronese taught and translated Strabo and Plutarch, and wrote commentaries on Cicero and Aristotle. He studied in Constantinople in order to advance his knowledge of Greek, bringing back with him a valuable collection of manuscripts of the classical texts. Vittorino Rambaldoni, in 1378 to 1446, developed new methods to teach the classical languages and their literatures. And the humanist educators believed that classical literature provided intellectual discipline, moral training, and civilized sentiments. The Studia Humanitatis, as mentioned before, was mainly, though not exclusively, a feature of school rather than university education. Many more people attended school than university, and in the universities, the study of law, medicine, and theology, and the disputes of metaphysics and logic at the very heart of philosophy, still dominated. But even in universities, the study of Greek, classical rhetoric, and poetry increased the more, and many humanist intellectuals were invited to lecture in or become professors of the universitas. At that time, it was an advantage for society that those who received a humanistic education were more likely to become chancellors of city-states than university professors, because they took the liberal outlook and wider horizons of their education into practical affairs. Princes and popes received such an education, whilst the majority of the populace remained mostly illiterate. And in the middle of the 15th century, Johannes Gutenberg's invention of the movable type printing press gave tremendous impetus to the book trade. Within decades, every major town in Europe had one or more printing businesses, and by the end of the century, the end of the 15th century, an estimated 20 million volumes had assembled from them, including hundreds of editions of classical texts translated and edited by humanists. Before the printing press, however, the book industry was good. Demand for scribes and copyists and new forms of script being introduced in order to make copying both faster and more legible was still something to be aware of. And for example, a popular and widely used cursive Italian script was invented by Niccolo di Niccoli, he did that in the 14th to 15th centuries. And that script, that cursive Italian script was the most frequently chosen form of script. Nicolai added to his calligraphic innovations the successful technique of editing texts into paragraphs and chapters, and so with a table of context at the beginning. And so we can really go thank a humanist scholar for adding and dividing text into paragraphs, for editing text into chapters, and for giving books tables of context for reference. And so the relation of humanism to philosophy in the Renaissance is seen most congenially in ethics and in political theory. So before the section on Renaissance political thought, the section of Renaissance humanism is now drawing to a close. I do want to make mention that Aristotle described ethics and politics as a continuous thing. And in the Renaissance, both Aristotelians and Platonists continued the tradition, and it persisted into the 17th century. There was a naturalness to this view in that each of the branches related to the others in a logical way. The individual, the home, and the state were the respective topics of ethics, economics, and political theory. Albertus Magnus described the connection between them in terms of an individual's relationships to himself, to his family, and in his civil relations to his society. Albertus Magnus' student was Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas, who elaborated this view of the natural sociality of humankind in his commentary on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and this view remained dominant throughout the Renaissance. I also recommend at this point to read St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, a wonderful text, not surpassed by anyone other than his predecessor, Augustine, St. Augustine. But what the Renaissance added, actually, was an intensification of interest in human nature. Who would it be if not for Petrarch, the first to turn away from bewailing the misery of man, medieval religion, and to celebrate human dignity instead? See the translation of Petrarch's view of human life, translated by Susanna Dobson in 1791, called De Remediis Utriusque Fortunae. It is a wise series of 254 dialogues through which runs a Stoic theme of modesty and fortitude. Read Poggio Bracciolini de Miseria Humanae Conditionis, which is translates to on the misery of the human condition. Discussion of the nature of humanity involved comparisons between humans and other animals. The idea became commonplace that humankind is defenseless and naked to the real world, but with only one gift, that of intelligence. Ficino argued that the possession of intelligence makes man like unto the gods, for by its means he can exploit all the advantages that the other animals have, i.e. the ox strength, the horse's swiftness, the wool of the sheep for warmth in cold climates. But curiously enough, Nicholas Cusa claimed that humanity's powers of imagination and creativity was a reflection on humanity's own distinct created world of the mentality. The increasing ideas that describe the dignity of humanity as a near-divine creature was in fact Pico's view that humans have the ability to create who they are and can be whatever they individually choose to be, while occupying any position in the scheme of life, from the lowest to the very highest of occupations. And this makes another solid point, implied that there is absolutely no predestined place or goal for man, that thing that religious people try to tell you, that ultimately, unless it be humans and humans' own choosing to aim for a creative achievement. So there's no predestined place or goal unless if one chooses or has an aim for their own creative achievement. And so here in the Renaissance, we see the idea of human resisting that which opposes creativity and free thinking. Ironically enough, the exalted view of human nature fostered by Renaissance humanism met its hubristic opposite in the 16th century Reformatio, with the Reformation's reassertion of humanity's fallen nature, the religious view that humans are hopelessly corrupt and totally depraved and impotent without the grace of God. People must not forget that before modernity and before the scientific revolution and subsequent enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries, many 16th century people were still very much religious up until the Darwinian revolution of the long 19th century. And after all, the 16th century produced the Reformation, which was in part a retaliation against Renaissance thought. Therefore, Renaissance humanists were religious, at the very least in profession and practice, regardless of what they actually privately thought, since during this time, the 14th and 15th centuries, there was literally there was absolutely no life outside one's religion. And indeed, Aristotle had taught that the highest good, the sunum bonum, was happiness, eudaimonia. However, the Renaissance thinkers interpreted wrongly and identified this with their religious belief. Life eternal in the presence of the deity, as promised to the faithful as their just reward for their virtue. Renaissance art hid not the sources of pleasure and joy, as did medieval art, not least in the contemplation of beauty. But not only was medieval art unlike real life, the religious teachings were as well, unlivable, and therefore ethical views more adapted to a normal human lifespan in the known world had to be borrowed. And so here we find, even at the earliest stages of Christendom, a Saint Basil the Great of Caesarea in the 4th century CE advising a selective use of pagan philosophical writings as an aid or supplemental script to reflection on virtue. And but by this time, people of religion were still being commanded by gods to offer animal sacrifices and to kill those who abused their names. Let it be remembered that other religious intellectuals followed suit to Nicholas Cusa and in general preferred Stoicism and Platonism to Epicureanism and Aristotelianism as sources of inspiration. And as a matter of fact, Aristotle's ethics received rehabilitation in the works of St. Thomas Aquinas, but during the High Renaissance, both Cicero and Seneca came to be admired greatly. Interestingly to note that some educators of the time felt that they had the license to use pagan philosophical ethics as a supplement to their religious texts, but their inconsistency reveals itself when they only did so when they were comfortably consistent with each other, the text that is, regardless if the educators knew not the inconsistencies of their own ancient religious texts. Plato's idea of a disembodied state of an immaterial soul and his notion of perfect contemplation of the supreme good in his Phaedo, Republic, and Symposium have many parallels in several religious texts that have been written before and after Plato's time. In the actual universities, Aristotle was the instrumental dominant figure with regard to the study of ethics. Stoicism and Epicureanism were not as influential in the Renaissance as Platonism and Aristotle were, since they were known, but not as much. Epicureanism received a bad press because of its identification with pleasure as the greatest good, and it was often condemned by religious people. And in fact, those who sought to defend the actual views of Epicurus by arguing that he was too often criticized by those who had not read his writings, such as Leonardo Bruno in 1548 to 1600, and Vanini in 1585 to 1619, were burned until death, and then after a little more. So even people who argued that, who criticized these writers, they were burned to death by the church and by the state, who was controlled by the church. And so, as this was, with this on the mind, recognize that the freedom and liberty of original or novel ethical debate did not actually occur in the period of the Renaissance. It is only from the Enlightenment and onward that we actually see the rebirth of ethical debate. We see that we've seen the Platonism, we've seen some, now we're going to go to some political thought, and we've already gone to humanism, from Epictetus to Descartes, from Epicurus to Hume, from Copernicus to Newton. The very destruction of civilization is paramount, given that the absence of knowledge leads to an absence of power. Should we not forget that at Alexandria and in other parts of the Near East and further east in India and China, enormous and magnificent cities were built for the prosperity of humanity? The Renaissance in the 17th century ushered in modern science. In the work and developments of the 19th century physicists Faraday and Maxwell, there is a summary of the two major discoveries, the inconvertibility of all forms of energy and the electromagnetic theory of light. And as to the origin and fate of the universe, this presents, in my view, a self-consistent, coherent picture. The base of these discoveries were experimental science and technology, is where experimental science and technology mingle, are merely constructs of the human mind, but they also are theoretical, a matter of experiment and thinking about their applications with regard to statements of fact and scientifically, producing a credulous theory, which is the essence of science, and a catalog of the properties of matter and motion. All right, so then we're going to get to the rise of modern thought. Let's see here. So we're almost done with the Reformation. We're going to go through the religious Reformation and partly just a very brief period about the scientific revolution. I do want to talk really quickly about religion. That religion was invented when the first con man met the first fool. A quote by Mark Twain. Let's see. I'm going to skip over that, and I'm going to go to the rise of modern thought. From the 4th to the 14th century CE, the increasing dominion of religion over the mind of Europe's intellectual population meant that philosophy was largely the handmaiden of theology, including doctrinal orthodoxies imposed by the Church. This imposement that constituted the character of that time was broken not because the Reformation introduced a new intellectual liberalism, rather the opposite, when considering the inflexibilities of Calvinism, for example, but because religious authorities in most parts of Europe that split from the Church's Catholicism did not have the power to enforce theological orthodoxy or to control speculation and inquiry. So what is important to note here is that by Luther's attempts to try to be orthodox and get to the bottom line of what the authors were saying in the scriptures, going back to the Hebrew and the Greek, he actually caused the world to become more secular rather than religious, because he actually encouraged people to translate the text into the common tongue of German and Latin, and from Latin to German, and from Hebrew to Greek, and from Greek to German, Greek to Latin, and then Latin to German. And because he encouraged the translations of text, people at the time could actually read them for themselves and think for themselves, and then eventually saw the illogical consistencies within them. And so one immediate result of the Protestant Reformation was interest in magic and mysticism, but there was also a liberation of philosophical and scientific inquiry. Again, half a century before Luther's protest in 1517, in the middle of the 15th century, Gutenberg's printing press had been copied in hundreds of cities and towns across the western Eurasia. Millions of printed books had already been poured out, a dramatic instance which displays how the rapid adoption of new technology can change history. But it was also clear to more perceptive minds that among many endeavors were the possibilities for achieving greater comprehension of the world. What was required to disentangle sense from nonsense was a method given to us by two men of the 16th century, Luther not one of them, namely it was Francis Bacon and René Descartes, which we will get to later on. Regarded as the founders of modern philosophy as distinct from ancient, medieval, and contemporary, they gave us the scientific method and the hypothetical deductive method. In describing and applying the methods they advocated, they thereby rejected the false assumptions and the theological restrictions that since the Middle Ages had increasingly weighed down and cluttered up the philosophical enterprise that once flourished in the times of classical antiquity. What Bacon and Descartes had in common was their rejection of scholasticism and its Aristotelian foundations. They differed in respect that was important for the subsequent history that was to unfold. Bacon was empiricist, Descartes a rationalist in epistemological sense. And this led to a conventional grouping of philosophers who existed in the 17th and 18th centuries, such as Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, Spinoza, and Leibniz. Rationalism, in the epistemological sense, is the view that genuine knowledge can be obtained only by reason, by rational inference from first principles, logical foundations, and self-evident truths. Empiricism, on the other hand, again, is the view that all genuine knowledge must either originate or be testable by experience of the world and sensory experience. Seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, and smelling, aided by the instruments, telescopes, microscopes, oscilloscopes, etc., that extend the range and power of observation. Natural science is the paradigm for empiricists in regards to knowledge. It involves observation and experiment. Mathematics and logic provide the rationalists with a paradigm. The conclusions of mathematics and logical thinking are eternal, unchanging, and certain, which is what the rationalists argue truth should be. And in this way of thinking, Plato definitely is an influence. 17th and 18th century philosophy ends with Immanuel Kant, who argued for a synthesis between empiricism and rationalism. Both experience and thought of the world as we experience and think about the world arise from a combination of the inputs of experience and the action of the mind upon them. Neither experience of the world nor the world as we experience it is possible otherwise. When we get to the Reformation period, we see in 1517 Luther writes his 95 Theses. We also see a century later, in 1618, the 30 Years' War, which was prominently because of religion. There's a rivaling division. It's in a Holy Roman Empire context. Luther differed from the Swiss in regard to communion and baptism, primarily due to differences within their theology. We see Philip Melanchthon's work as a Hebrew scholar. We see Luther's theology, the doctrine of what I've said before, total depravity of humanity, was the essential occasion for the Reformation's main doctrine. That people are not good, and they can only become good because of God and through faith in Christ. The Imago Dei, or the image of God, was pertinent. It was applied to humanity or creatures in general. This was a positive thing. It gave a sense of goodness, truth, and righteousness in humanity and the created order at the time that was believed in. At the time, we had the Ottoman Turks in the Balkans, the Habsburgs, were ruling in the 16th and 18th centuries during that time in Central Europe. The devil at this time was a character that represented evil, and it was an image that opposed the goodness of God. Martin Bucer came second to Luther. He influenced the Swiss Enlightenment and the Swiss gentleman Jean Calvin, who wrote the Institutes of the Christian Religion. We have the Swiss Reformation. We see that each town had its own reformer. We had also Zwingli at the time, and the ideas of extreme unction and all that jazz. We see Johannes Hunter in Transylvania and Romania, was a reformer there. We see Matthias Illyricus. He was a Serbo-Croatian, writing in the 16th century. We see ecclesiastical centers in Jena, Regensburg, Antwerp, Frankfurt, and Strasbourg. There's a Reformatio in Poland. John A. Lasco. We see Paolo Vergerio. He was an Italian educator, the elder and the younger. One was an Italian educator, the other one was an Italian bishop. Regardless, though, Latin was actually the core of liberal education at the time of the Reformation. As papal secretary to Innocent the Seventh and Gregory the 12th, he helped to organize the Council of Constance. Paolo Vergio also served the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, for whom he translated Arrian's biography of Anabasis Alexander the Great into Latin. There were other notable works on restoring unity in the church and the life of Petrarch. Primoz Trubar was burned at Tübingen, but he translated the New Testament of the Christian scriptures to the Slovenian, Croatian, and Slavic languages. He was educated in Salzburg and Vienna, and he also met humanistic writers, in particular Erasmus of Rotterdam. John Knox led the Reformation in Scotland and England in the 16th century, and then in Latin and English, Thomas Cranmer led the Reformatio in England under Henry VIII and Edward VI. And of course, he wrote 39 articles under Elizabeth I. So, in Lutheranism, we also see these territories and regions being under the control of the empire, and this was important because we had different territories or regions were formalizing separate identities. This was relevant for the eventual establishment of the modern nation state, starting from the Napoleonic period and beyond. Anyways, each one was under a reformer and local noble, duke, magistrate, prince, etc. I probably won't go any more about the Reformation. We do need to know that there were churches at this time. These churches, these huge cathedrals, became centers of culture. They became known as centers of education as well for those who could not attend an education at the universities. The populace at large would at the least be educated, however, in order to be a moral citizen. This continued after Luther and Melanchthon, Calvin, and Theodore Beza. And at these regional churches, indeed, even the most well-trained and educated scholar could at least interact, debate, and influence the illiterate peasant. All right, well, that is the end of the Renaissance and the Reformation. So thank you for watching. This is an extremely long video. It's almost an hour long. The next video will be on the Enlightenment, so stay tuned for that. And I hope you learned something in this video. Like I said, the Renaissance period is so instrumental and so foundational to the development of humans in historical context. From getting us away from the dogmatic slumber of the Middle Ages and spurring us on into more robust ways of thinking and that led to the birth of reason itself, which we will see in the Enlightenment. Thank you for watching, and as always, until next time.